Margaret Holloway had lived on Willow Creek Drive for 37 years. She had buried her husband in that town, raised 2 children in that house, and at 74 years old, she never imagined she'd hear a stranger standing on her porch shouting the words that changed everything. "You have 1 hour to remove yourself from the property." Margaret blinked. Standing in front of her were 3 county code enforcement officers. Behind them, with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face, stood HOA President Cynthia Mercer. And parked across the street, neighbors watched in disbelief. Margaret tightened her cardigan. There has to be some mistake. One of the officers looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we received reports regarding dangerous conditions, illegal modifications, and unpermitted structures. We have authority to inspect immediately." Margaret looked at Cynthia. The woman smiled. "Oh, don't act surprised, Margaret. You ignored enough warnings." Margaret's heart sank. Warnings? She had never received any warnings. Not one. And that's when Cynthia said something that made several neighbors freeze. "Maybe if you people learned to follow rules, this neighborhood wouldn't be falling apart." You people. Margaret understood exactly what she meant. Ever since Richard Holloway passed away 3 years earlier, Cynthia had made her life miserable. First, it was complaints about bird feeders. Then the flower garden Richard had built with his own hands. Then accusations about paint colors. And when Margaret refused to sell her house after developers began buying properties nearby, Cynthia's harassment became personal. But this was different. This was humiliation. And it was happening in front of the entire neighborhood. Code Officer Daniel Reeves stepped forward. "Ma'am, we'll need access to the backyard." Margaret's voice trembled. "My husband built that gazebo himself. We just need to inspect." Before she could answer, Cynthia interrupted. "Better check the shed, too. That's probably illegal." Daniel frowned. "Mrs. Mercer, please let us do our job." But Cynthia wasn't interested in letting anyone do their job. She wanted a spectacle, and she was enjoying every second. Across the street, 80-year-old Walter Gaines walked over. "Margaret has lived here longer than any of us. Leave her alone." Cynthia rolled her eyes. "Mind your own business, Walter." But Walter wasn't backing down. Neither were several other neighbors. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. As officers inspected the backyard, Daniel's expression slowly changed. There was nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, nothing unsafe. Everything was maintained perfectly. The gazebo had permits. The shed had permits. Even the small greenhouse had county approval. Daniel looked confused. "Ma'am, where did you keep these records?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Richard saved everything." She pointed to a weathered filing cabinet. "My husband believed paperwork solved problems." Daniel nodded. "Smart man." Meanwhile, Cynthia's smile was disappearing. Because this wasn't going according to plan. Not at all. Then Daniel opened one final folder, and his eyebrows shot upward. "Mrs. Holloway." Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Yes. This permit wasn't issued 8 years ago." "What do you mean?" Daniel stared at the document. "It was renewed 18 months ago." Margaret frowned. "That can't be. My husband passed away 3 years ago." Daniel looked puzzled. "Then who signed the renewal?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "I have no idea." Cynthia suddenly stepped forward. "Can we stop wasting time?" Obviously, she's forgotten what she's done. Daniel ignored her. Something about the paperwork bothered him. Very bothered him. He took out his phone and called county records. 10 minutes later, his face changed completely. "What?" Another officer looked over. "What is it?" Daniel covered the phone. "The permit renewal wasn't submitted by Mrs. Holloway." He paused. "It was submitted electronically from someone else's account." Margaret looked confused. "What does that mean?" Daniel lowered his voice. "It means that somebody accessed county records under false information." The neighborhood grew silent. Walter stared at Cynthia, and for the first time all morning, the HOA president looked nervous. "Well, that sounds like a county problem," she said quickly. But Daniel was already asking another question. "Mrs. Holloway, did you authorize anyone to act on your behalf?" "No." "Anyone at all?" "No." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we have a problem." Cynthia laughed nervously. "Oh, honestly, you're making this bigger than it is." But Daniel wasn't laughing. because county records had just confirmed something disturbing. The IP address used for those submissions had originated inside Willow Creek Estates, and one name appeared repeatedly as a registered contact. Cynthia Mercer. The smile vanished from her face. What? Daniel looked directly at her. Mrs. Mercer, were you involved with these filings? Of course not. Then why does your information appear on county records? Color drained from her face. I don't know. Neighbors exchanged worried glances. Walter folded his arms. Oh, Lord. But Cynthia recovered quickly. This is ridiculous. She pointed at Margaret. She's trying to blame me because she violated rules. Daniel's expression hardened. No, ma'am. You don't understand. I understand enough. He stepped aside and quietly made another phone call. Not to county records. Not to code enforcement headquarters. But to the sheriff's office. And less than 40 minutes later, 3 patrol cars rolled onto Willow Creek Drive. Margaret's eyes widened. Neighbors stepped onto their lawns. And Cynthia Mercer suddenly stopped talking because Sheriff Nolan Briggs himself had just stepped out of his vehicle. And the first words out of his mouth made everyone freeze. Mrs. Mercer. He held up a folder. We need to talk about forgery. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood in the middle of Willow Creek Drive, holding a thick folder in one hand. Nobody spoke. Not the neighbors. Not the code officers. Not even Cynthia Mercer. The smile that had been on the HOA president's face all morning had completely disappeared. She forced out a nervous laugh. Forgery? Sheriff, this is ridiculous. Nolan Briggs didn't laugh. Mrs. Mercer, we'd like you to come with us. Cynthia folded her arms. On what grounds? The sheriff opened the folder. Fraudulent filings. Unauthorized use of county records. Identity misrepresentation. Margaret Holloway looked stunned. So, somebody really did this? Sheriff Briggs turned toward her. Yes, ma'am. He looked back at Cynthia. And we've been investigating it for 2 months. The entire street went quiet. 2 months? Walter Gaines nearly dropped his coffee. What? Briggs nodded. Several elderly homeowners reported strange violations over the past year. Missing documents. Fake complaints. Unusual pressure to sell. Margaret felt cold. Pressure to sell. 3 months earlier, she'd received an offer for her home. Cash. Way below market value. She'd refused. Then came endless HOA letters. Complaints. Threats. Fees. And now a raid. She slowly looked at Cynthia. You were trying to force me out. Cynthia laughed again. This is insane. But nobody was laughing anymore. Daniel Reeves, the code officer, stepped forward. We checked every complaint filed against Mrs. Holloway. He looked disgusted. Most of them came from anonymous accounts. Sheriff Briggs nodded. And those accounts traced back to one person. Cynthia's face turned pale. This is harassment. No, Briggs replied calmly. What happened to Mrs. Holloway was harassment. The neighbors began whispering. Then someone unexpected stepped forward. Darlene Foster, vice president of the HOA board. Cynthia, her voice shook. Tell me this isn't true. Cynthia stared at her. Darlene, don't be stupid. But Darlene looked heartbroken. We trusted you. She turned toward the sheriff. I didn't know any of this. Briggs nodded. We know. Then he removed several papers from the folder. We also know about your meetings. Cynthia froze. What meetings? The meetings with East Ridge Development Group. Margaret blinked. Development Group? Walter Gaines looked confused. What development group? Sheriff Briggs sighed. Developers have been buying homes around Willow Creek Estates. Several neighbors exchanged worried glances. They planned to build luxury townhomes. Margaret's blood ran cold. Briggs continued. Most homeowners refused to sell. So pressure started. Walter stared at Cynthia. You sold us out. No. But the sheriff kept talking. We recovered emails. He held up printed copies. Mrs. Mercer promised to help lower property values by creating HOA disputes and encouraging complaints. Gasps spread through the crowd. Walter's face turned red. Good Lord. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. 37 years. 37 years in that house. Richard had planted every rose bush, built the gazebo, painted the nursery, and this woman wanted it gone for money. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. You wanted my home. Cynthia exploded. "Oh, stop acting like a victim." Everyone froze, and she kept going. "Look around, Margaret." She pointed angrily. "Old houses, old people. Nobody wants this place anymore." The words hung in the air. Several neighbors stared at her in disbelief. Walter's voice broke. "Old people." He was 80 years old. Darlene was 76. Most of Willow Creek had lived there for decades. Cynthia looked around and realized she had made a terrible mistake. But she wasn't finished. "I was trying to improve this neighborhood." Margaret wiped away tears. "My husband died in that bedroom upstairs." Her voice trembled. "Our grandchildren learned to ride bicycles on this street." She looked around at her neighbors. "We built this neighborhood." Walter nodded. "So did all of us." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sheriff Briggs broke the silence. Mrs. Mercer turned around. Cynthia's eyes widened. "No, Mom. No, this is political." "Turn around." She stepped backward. "You can't do this." But Briggs remained calm. "Forgery, fraud, identity theft, filing false reports, witness intimidation." He paused. "And conspiracy." The handcuffs clicked, and Willow Creek Drive became completely silent. Cynthia looked around desperately. Nobody came to her rescue. Nobody defended her. Not one person, because everyone had seen what she'd done to Margaret. As deputies escorted her toward the patrol car, she shouted, "You people will thank me someday." Walter Gaines shook his head. "No, Cynthia." His voice cracked. "We already had everything we needed." The patrol car drove away, and with it, years of fear. Margaret stood quietly in her front yard. Then she broke down crying. Not because Cynthia had been arrested, not because she'd won, but because Richard wasn't there. He should have been standing beside her. He should have seen this. Suddenly, Walter wrapped an arm around her shoulder. Then Darlene, then another neighbor, and another, until half the street surrounded Margaret. Darlene smiled through tears. "You're not alone." Walter laughed softly. "And you're definitely not moving." Everyone chuckled. A week later, the HOA board voted unanimously. Cynthia Mercer was permanently removed. The illegal fines against Margaret were erased. The county dismissed every false complaint. And 6 months later, Willow Creek Estates held its annual block party, something they hadn't done in years. Children ran across the lawns. Neighbors shared homemade pies. And for the first time since Richard's death, Margaret smiled without forcing it. As the sun set, she sat beneath the gazebo Richard had built with his own hands. Walter sat beside her. You know what Richard would say? Margaret smiled. "What?" Walter grinned. "He'd say paperwork solves problems." Margaret laughed through tears. "Yes." She looked at the house. Their house. Still standing. Still home. And finally, at peace.